Hey everyone, and welcome to the Sunny Go One Piece podcast. On this episode, we're going to be diving into episodes 653 through 655, which will cover manga chapters 722 through 724. And the Sunny is under attack, but can the Straw Hats and Law fend off the onslaught of attacks from many different directions? So, synopsis. The crew aboard the Sunny are in a great deal of trouble as Giolla has taken over the ship and the Straw Hats with her art powers, while Law has to keep Doflamingo and Fujitora away from Caesar and the Sunny. So again, in keeping with Dressrosa's atrocious pacing issues, there are a lot of differences and filler things that are added to elongate these episodes. So yeah, the first one in the anime, we get to see Giolla get back up and get an extra action scene with round 2 against her, but this time with all 4 of the Straw Hats and Momo, I guess, fighting back at once and to defeat her once and for all. Whereas in the manga, much of this happens off screen and we don't really see this outside of Violet showing us that Nami's lightning attack hit Giolla from a far distance when she's using her Giro powers. In fact, the entire last third of the episode of episode 653 and this fight is all non-canon, and even Jolla's Heaven's Door art, where she somehow has the power to seemingly absorb them into like another art dimension, is completely created for the anime. The only actual canon scene is them all standing over Giolla as she has been knocked out unconscious and burned to a crisp. It does slow the pacing down, but I'm for the most part fine with this because it just expands on what we know actually did happen, but never actually got to see. However, them getting sucked into this art dimension for sure does not occur in the anime or in the manga, as Violet just mentions that she sees the lightning and nothing about the Sunny disappearing, which is another added filler scene encompassing all of this that is added to kind of fill that sort of plot hole or consistency issue that's created because of this extra filler. At the Colosseum, the anime devotes a large section to introducing and highlighting many of the named fighters like Cavendish, Slayman, Orlumbus, Agio, Damask, Mami, Achillea, and Rolling Logan, with Rolling Logan being the only one who actually gets a proper title card and introduction in the manga, but that actually doesn't happen until much later on in the fight, probably in a few episodes. I forgot to look up which episode, but he does actually get a proper reveal. But the anime takes its time to introduce all of these people. When some of these people were already introduced, like Cavendish and Orlumbus and Slayman were introduced earlier, so it's a little redundant to have them reintroduced yet again here. And then during this scene, there's a filler fight with Cavendish versus a character that was never really in the manga, I don't think. His name is Gardo. And this character and this fight doesn't take place in the manga at all. Another difference is along with Rebecca fighting off a bunch of those no-named fighters after that scene, and there's most of this is pretty much just all filler. The entire first half of episode 654 is complete filler until we return to Greenbit with the segment with Law, Doflamingo, and Fujitora. Another change is there's a few added filler scenes of Zoro trying to talk to Bartolomeo while he's freaking out overseeing Zoro, as well as more D-block fighting, and Sanji, as well as the Sunny crew, talking to the Tontara army group. These scenes are all kind of in the manga, however, they're just singular panels without any dialogue in a sort of a montage at the end of chapter 724 when Law is talking to Doflamingo. Now, in the anime, this actually does happen. There is a montage of all these different things happening while Law is declaring to Doflamingo that he's going to get back at him for whatever happened 13 years ago. The canon panels of Zoro and Kinemon yelling up at Bartolomeo, as well as Luffy grabbing the bars and being stunned at Rebecca's fighting abilities. But in the manga, we don't even see what Luffy is actually reacting to. Similarly, we don't actually hear dialogue, but we just get to see one panel each of the Sunny crew huddle around the Dendemushi while Sanji talks to the Tontara army group, which is comprised of Usopp, Robin, and Frankie, of them all listening back. And so there's no dialogue in these either. So all of these things are just added to elongate these episodes even further, which again just drags the pacing down horrendously. So that's about it for most of the main bigger differences. So let's just get into the episodes themselves. And the beginning of this episode begins with some very interesting world building and history of the One Piece world. Now, we've gotten hints as to the creation of the world government and the 20 kingdoms, but we get a lot more detail explained to us directly from Doflamingo. How 800 years ago, which coincided with the end of the Void Century, the world government consisted of 20 kings from 20 different countries that banded together to defeat the ancient kingdom, as Clover had mentioned during Robin's flashback in NES lobby. After their victory, they moved to the top of the Red Line to the Holy Land of Morijua. However, one interesting new bit of information is that among those 20 were the Nefertari family from Arabasta, i.e. Vivi's family, who opted not to join them. The remaining 19 and their descendants would all go on to become the present-day Celestial Dragons. This led those 19 countries to be left without a king, resulting in new royal families being elected to each one of those. Doflamingo goes on to explain that in the case of Dressrosa, the Riku family came to be the one that replaced the royal family, taking the place of the original royal family, which happened to be the Don Quixote family. Now, there can be no doubt that Doflamingo is a celestial dragon, but it begs the question, why is he running around as a pirate and not living up in Morijua as a celestial dragon? Also, why doesn't he look like an inbred freak like St. Charles or St. Mjosgard that we've seen in the past, like many of the other celestial dragons we've met so far? For me, at the time, this was the biggest sticking point, that there was something different about Doflamingo, almost like he has celestial dragon blood, but he's lying about certain aspects of it, or he was maybe adopted into it and wasn't actually really a celestial dragon, which is why he doesn't get to share in some of the same privileges. And I wish I remembered more about what I thought about this at the time, but this was kind of where my life started to get really busy, and I wasn't as obsessing over One Piece as much as I was prior to this or even since this. So much of this is kind of blended together with information that I know now, and so it's hard to separate what I knew then and what I know now, unfortunately. In any case, it's clear that Doflamingo still carries some of those privileges, as he can still somewhat have a Marine Admiral fight on his side, like the Celestial Dragons can. It's also crazy to think that Vivi could have been a Celestial Dragon, but you wonder why the Nefertari family decided not to join them. One could surmise that because the Nefertari family seemed to be good people, they saw that once they defeated the Ancient Kingdom, they either realized what the horrible things the world government was going to be capable of during the war, or saw the direction that they were headed in and decided not to join them. You could even potentially draw a conclusion because they saw the dangers in the world government and the mistakes they made by choosing the wrong side, decided to create the poneglyphs, which is why, King Cobra and his ancestors protected their poneglyphs so fiercely. It was their one way of preserving the past and maybe atoning for their mistakes. It's pretty nuts when you think about just how complex and interconnected the history of the One Piece world is becoming. You could literally start writing a book on the history of this fictional world alone and not even include any of the main characters, which is insane. Now, we will get the answer to Doflamingo's sort of lineage in this same set of episodes, but yeah, we'll get to that later. Now, speaking of the main characters, we finally get to catch up with what is happening on the Thousand Sunny, and it does not look good, as the progression of Nami, Chopper, and Momo have progressed to the point where they are now completely incapacitated, being turned into literal paintings at this point. However, Brook has somehow still managed to keep his body by getting into Giola's good graces by appealing to her artistic side as a musician and artist himself. And the others all think that Brook has betrayed them, but we know that there's no way Brook turned on them and is using this up as an opportunity to try and sneak attack Giolla by catching her off guard. And Giolla and her style of attack is very reminiscent of Mr. 3 or Gaudino back on Little Garden, as he was also very obsessed with being artistic with his attacks and being very beautiful with how he presents his attacks. And Giolla is pretty similar here. Even the idea of trapping her victims in a piece of artwork, slowly consuming them until they're suffocated to death, is also very similar to the candle server set that he used on Vivi, Nami, and Zoro back in Little Garden. And poor Nami has now been caught in 2 of these life-threatening art pieces. Brook, being the clever guy he is, convinces Giolla to turn his violin and cane back to normal so that he can play music, and then proceeds to slice her up instead without even noticing. And this is one of the few times where like Brooke's ability to cut people unnoticed is hella cool, as he just walks right past her casually and tells her she's already been sliced up, and then sheathes his sword, and then she gets cut up by his painting song bamboo flute slice. Wow, that's hard to say. Interestingly, in the anime, I think they accidentally omitted his like usual soul solid ice effect that was present in the manga, but I think this was down to a sort of a misinterpretation, as even in the manga you only see sort of the frosty smoke coming off her, but you know it's the frost because of the jagged edges of the smoke in the manga. And so I think this may be just a rushed sort of interpretation of it, and they just forgot. So I'm not going to necessarily blame them too much for it. There's also a skull joke here that's definitely lost in translation here, despite the Crunchyroll subs trying to explain it. And this one, I don't blame them, because there's so much to this joke that it would take too long to fully explain in the subtitles. So first off, in Japanese, the move Brooke uses is called ekaki uta hitoyogiri, which ekaki is painting or drawing, and then uta is song. And then ekaki uta is drawing song, which is a general term used for songs that teach children how to draw. And here's where things get complicated. The second half of the move is called hitoyogiri. Now, literally translated as an attack, it's called one joint slice, hito being one, and yo being joint, and giri being slice, or cut, I guess. Similar to Zoro's onigiri, which is demon slice or demon cut. However, in terms of music, a hitoyogiri is a bamboo flute. So it has a double meaning as an attack and a musical term, which is very on brand for Brooke. But to take it one step further, Oda decides to use this as a skull joke, as Brooke says, quote, "I'm sorry, but I don't understand visual art, after all, because my eyes are not holes." In English, you kind of can't understand this, what he's saying, but there's not really a joke here, because it's just literally he's just saying stuff. And it doesn't quite land, because in Japanese there's a saying that someone who has the inability to figuratively see things that are clearly visible to everyone, has not holes for eyes, or hushiana. Now, not to say they are literally blind, but it's similar to when in English you see someone who can't see something that's clearly in front of them, and you exasperatedly yell at them, "Are you blind?" The last layer of this joke is that the kanji for joint, or yo, in hitoyogiri is the same as hushi in hushiana, aka not holes, that leads Brooke to use his own attack name as the basis for his skull joke that he can't understand visual arts because he has holes for eyes, by tying that into the common phrase of having hushiana, or not holes for eyes. It's definitely really complicated and a multi-layered wordplay joke for sure, that I don't think I even adequately explained here, because it's so much. And by this point, the joke is not even funny because I've over-explained it at this point. But yeah, it's not a really easy one to translate, and I don't think it can adequately be translated, because we don't have that same saying of, if someone who can't really see or notice things has hushiana for eyes. Now that I've sufficiently bored you to death with a long-winded explanation of a language joke, for a rather benign joke at that, and that lasted all of 10 seconds, we next learn what became of Kinemon, Sanji, and Zoro. Sanji, always being the reliable one to make a plan, he gives Kinemon a map to where they think Kanjuro is being held, and instructions for what to do next, while he now, instead of Zoro, heads to the Sunny to help out, while Zoro and Kinemon stay behind to try and warn Luffy about the Marines. But with just the two of them and no Sanji, they can't figure out what to do next, because all that comes to Zoro's mind is just brute force his way through everything, when the situation calls for a little bit more of a subtle approach. And the exchange here between the pairs is freaking hilarious. Since the Colosseum is sealed off completely, Zoro suggests they just slash their way through, to which Kinemon yells back, "That would be way too conspicuous." Then Zoro suggests, "Okay, then let's just gently slash it open," with Kinemon yelling that that's not the question. It's not a question of intensity. And yeah, I like this pairing of the two samurais, essentially. Zoro's not officially a samurai, but let's be real, he is basically one. But yeah, during this argument, Bartolomeo happens to be walking by inside the Colosseum and immediately clocks that it's Zoro and proceeds to just fanboy about Zoro as well, which I love. Anytime Bartolomeo like freaks out about any of the Straw Hat members, I love. Like every scene he freaks out is so much fun and hilarious because of how relatable it is. However, I wonder how Bartolomeo knows about Zoro taking down the 100 Baroque Works bounty hunters in Whiskey Peak. This has been a question I think a lot of fans ask when they read this, because it's, I doubt this was ever reported on in a newspaper or something, so the only explanation is that he's such a super fan that he somehow deduced this by piecing together all the clues he collected, which is insane dedication, and again mirrors just how crazy real life fans are in terms of like piecing together clues to come up with theories and to fill in blanks that Oda hasn't explicitly stated in the story. But yeah, I don't think Oda has actually explicitly answered how Bartolomeo knew about this in an SBS section, so for now, it's pretty much just speculation. Now, around this time in a separate scene, we are properly introduced to yet another one of the Don Quixote family members, Gladius of the Pika army, and this guy's design is probably one of my favorite of the entire family. Like, he's got this like sort of steampunk-esque style, and his name is also a reference to the Gladius sword, which is a Roman short sword, tying into sort of the Roman Colosseum theme. And the fact his hair seems to spike out into sharp blades, no doubt due in part to a devil fruit of some sort, that's not revealed here yet. And I think among the Don Quixote family from a character design perspective, Gladius is my favorite. But in terms of overall characters, there is one who stands well above the rest, and if you know, you know. A certain hard-boiled family member takes the cake on this one. Now, finally getting back to the green bit, and we finally get somewhat of an answer to what exactly Doflamingo is and his relation to the Celestial Dragons, and it turns out, yes, he is in fact a Celestial Dragon, and we were right to think that it was a little strange that despite his Celestial Dragon status that he doesn't seem to be living like one, but still has some of their privileges, and it turns out that he used to be one. Unfortunately, he doesn't really elaborate for us what led him to lose his status as a Celestial Dragon, but one bit of dialogue that I absolutely love in this exchange is how Doflamingo says that he'd love to tell Law his life story, but he needs to go deal with the Straw Hats because so many people have been burned by him by underestimating Luffy. And two reasons I love this one, because first off, Luffy is really getting the notoriety and status that he so deserves, and it's crazy seeing a villain like Doflamingo be cautious of Luffy. And like I've said in the past, it's just amazing and awesome seeing Luffy's power and reputation become closer and closer to those pirates that we've feared along the way. The second is this shows just how intelligent Doflamingo is. Like, he's arrogant in his own power, sure, but he's not stupid. He recognizes the threat that Luffy poses despite how silly he looks on the outside and takes him seriously, which makes Doflamingo an incredibly scary villain. And later on, when Law makes a run for it, we can see more of just how cunning he is compared to any villain we've faced yet, as Oda allows us to see Doflamingo thinking in real time and sniffs out what Law is trying to do and changes his plans accordingly instead of just taking the bait and following Law like he wants him. And Doflamingo instead decides to target the Sunny. To be honest, this is really refreshing to see a villain that has this level of intellect. Like, Crocodile was a smart villain, for sure, but his mistake was underestimating Luffy and trusting Robin due to his own arrogance and his strength and power. If he had been more cautious, then Luffy would have easily lost to Crocodile. Lucci was also an intelligent villain, but the problem with him is that most of his decision-making was handled by the idiot Spandam, and operated more as a tool of the world government than an actual independent thinker. So seeing a villain like Doflamingo who seems to always be one step ahead of our heroes is a really refreshing change of pace, in my opinion. And it really sort of elevates the threat level and stakes of having to face Doflamingo of all villains. Because up till now, he has been billed as one of these villains that is sort of insurmountably strong and very terrifying to face, more so than any other villain we've faced yet. Now that he's heading straight for the Sunny, one thought I always had with this scene is, why didn't Law just use Room and shambles him back to the island? Or for that matter, why doesn't he amputate him or cut him in half or something? Use his mess to pull out his heart? It's like any one of these different things that these OP things that Law can do with his power. But I guess the simple explanation is that Doflamingo's haki is strong enough to prevent Law from using many of his powers on him. The anime even takes it one step further to subtly emphasize this point by showing the fighting fish get scared, similar to how the Lord of the Coast reacted to Shanks in Luffy's flashback, to imply that Doflamingo has Conqueror's haki. And this moment of the fighting fish scattering due to the approaching Doflamingo is not in the manga, but it does, I guess, make sense. Although this is almost immediately disproven in a scene later where Law does manage to shamble Doflamingo to save Sanji from the overheat attack. With Law kind of helplessly stuck on the coast as he watches Doflamingo get ready to shred Nami, Chopper, Brook, and Momo, and all hope seems to be lost, the Straw Hat that always comes in for the surprise save arrives. Although this wasn't really all that surprising, but very cool nonetheless. Sanji gives it his all, but even he proves to be no match for Doflamingo, and Law comes in to rescue him. And like I said, Law was able to shambles him, but it could be because maybe he was caught off guard. I honestly have no explanation for this other than sort of contrived writing, like just Deus Ex Machina. And like if Law can do this, why not like toss a rock on the surface of the water and shambles Doflamingo right into the water or something like that? It doesn't, I don't know, I understand from a narrative sense, like it doesn't make sense to just do it that way, but Law, I feel like Oda has sort of written himself into a lot of corners with how powerful Law's fruit is without really giving many explanations as to like how to avoid letting those powers become too OP, because his powers can like solve so many issues and it's so strong and so versatile that you have to somehow come up with explanations as to like why he doesn't use it a certain way. Otherwise, he'd just end up one-shotting, villains or his opponents very easily. I will say a lot later on down the line, Law does kind of explain why he can't just use his powers on certain people, particularly ones that are stronger than him. So there is that. But yeah, I mean, it's still pretty inadequate, especially at this point in the story. I remember reading this thinking, why doesn't Law do this? Or why doesn't Law just do that? You just look at every situation and be like, seems like he can do a lot of things that he just doesn't, just out of story convenience. One thing I do like about this fight is it adds to the sense of just how much of a threat Doflamingo is by having him go up against Sanji, and Sanji being unable to really hurt him. And while Doflamingo does admit that Sanji is one of the stronger ones, he's still unable to get through his defenses nor get past his string powers, which as the viewer or reader, you start to get in your head like, how is Luffy going to defeat Doflamingo? And I personally love this because we finally have a real challenge for Luffy for the first time in the post-time skip era. One thing, as you know, that I haven't really liked about the post-time skip era, and if you've been listening, is how I've mentioned how the villains have been very lackluster. Haven't really been a challenge for Luffy so far in the post-time skip era, which is, I know it's been intentional, and yeah, it just hasn't really been exciting, or the stakes aren't that high. But that all changes with Doflamingo finally, because we've gone from like these very easy, lackluster villains to probably one of the most terrifying ones in the entire series. He not only is a credible threat in terms of raw strength, Conqueror's haki, a strong devil fruit, but he is incredibly conniving and intelligent, making him a super difficult villain for someone like Luffy to most likely deal with, or at least that's the way, I originally approached this. And, on the other hand, I also thought about the fact that this might work in Luffy's favor, like so many others, that Luffy's sort of stupidity and simplicity might actually get under their skin, and especially someone who's as cold and calculating as Doflamingo. But then again, I could also see how Doflamingo could be smart enough not to get affected by that. But again, just the fact that I'm having these thoughts of like, how is Luffy going to beat Doflamingo and in what form is that going to take is really fun, like to see this. And you really start to get this sense that Doflamingo is hiding a lot of abilities and this guy is crazy strong. In any case, Law manages to divert Doflamingo's devastating attack Overheat, which interestingly, the anime, to go along with the name of the attack, adds a heated effect onto it when the manga really doesn't give any indication of that. But I think that's fine to take those kinds of artistic liberties to make it more visually interesting. The kanji used in the name is literally translated as excess whip string, which I believe is what the Crunchyroll subs call it, but alternatively read as overheat or obahito. And so when you isolate the last two syllables in the word of heat, in Japanese hito, you can find the word ito, which is Japanese for string, which is obviously the name of Doflamingo's fruit, ito ito no mi. And so that's kind of where that wordplay comes in with that move name. At this point, Law, seeing just how disadvantageous of a position they're in, with Fujitora throwing a gunship at them and Doflamingo quickly returning after being shambled, tells Nami to take Caesar and head to the next island, Zou, and that they will catch up with them once they destroy the factory. But obviously Nami refuses at first, but seeing the onslaught of attacks from Fujitora, she and Chopper quickly change their tunes. And I love how casual Fujitora is during all this, as his sort of lackadaisical approach to his duties also mirrors Aokichi. As you see, Fujitora is doing all of this, like lifting a gunship and raining down meteors while eating a bowl of ramen, which is actually really impressive that he has such control of his powers. He doesn't even really need to focus to use them, like to this degree too, that he can just do all this stuff while not really like concentrating on it. He just kind of like second-handedly does it. Weirdly, though, Fujitora senses something and orders his men to divert their forces back to Dressrosa, and most likely this is kind of due to his incredible observation haki, most likely because of, obviously he's blind, so he must rely on observation haki to be able to see things, but that probably allows him to sense a lot more as well. We don't really get any indication as to what he's sensing, but he senses something changing in terms of the tide of the conflict. So he rediverts his forces back to Dressrosa, kind of saving the Straw Hats a little bit. Going back to Doflamingo, though, interestingly, he does seem to actually care about his actual family members, essentially the officers that are in his main family, because this is now the second instance where he shows genuine care and concern for them. First was at the tail end of the Punk Hazard arc, when Baby 5 and Buffalo were essentially cut down by Law. And now when Giolla is taken hostage by Law, even when she offers her own life, Doflamingo won't actually sacrifice her, which I found very interesting, how even for the main villain as evil as Doflamingo, he still values the idea of family and his crew, and will protect those he cares about. Hell, Doflamingo even was still willing to forgive Law, as Baby 5 mentioned at the end of Punk Hazard arc, that he still was saving the heart or the Corazon seat for Law, and even now that spot still remains empty. Probably, I would assume not anymore, as Law has probably pissed him off to no end at this point, but up until that point, Doflamingo was willing to let Law back in and take one of his sort of officer seats alongside Pika, Diamante, and Treble. And what's crazy about this is if you overthink it, like I kind of like to do about this stuff, and take it one step further, when you think about how, despite Doflamingo being an evil pirate, the Don Quixote family is still better than the world government and how they treat their subordinates. The world government is essentially willing to sacrifice anyone and everyone to maintain their power and their reputation, to the point they're willing to wipe out the entire islands of their own men, like with Enies Lobby, or waste lives at Marineford before Kobe stepped in to put a stop to it. And even Akainu was straight up ready to murder Kobe, one of their own officers, for caring about his fellow soldiers' lives before Shanks, a pirate mind you, came to his aid and also insisted they stop further bloodshed. And so this is an interesting sort of commentary on just how bad the world government really is. Like, you think the pirates are bad, and even the evil ones are really bad, but you know what's worse? The world government is even worse in terms of how they treat their subordinates and their people. And I thought that was an interesting distinction. And to close it out, just as Sanji had started to suspect that there was more to Law and Doflamingo, and the cliffhanger for the end of these sets of episodes is that despite the mission being to destroy the Smile Factory, Law himself has some kind of a grudge to settle with Doflamingo about something that occurred 13 years ago, and what that is we won't find out, at least for not a little bit. But yeah, this one's a doozy. I really liked this reveal, and not this specific one, but the actual reveal of what they're talking about here. And so yeah, I can't wait to talk about that. Unfortunately, we don't get to talk about that for a little while now. I would assume, if I can remember correctly, probably not for 10 or so more episodes, if I'm counting correctly. I didn't really look at the episode listings, but yeah, I think it's about 8 to 10 episodes or so we actually get to learn what this really means. But anyways, we'll talk about that when we get there. But if you did enjoy this, send me a like or comment. If you want to join me on this journey of rewatching One Piece, please consider subscribing. Check out my Instagram at SunnyGo Podcast for updates when I post new episodes and see some pictures of my manga collection and card collection. And I'm finally starting to post again, thankfully. It's been a very busy several months, but I'm finally getting back on that. But yeah, and like I always say, just listening to the podcast is enough for me, but if you feel like supporting me, please feel free to support me via my Buy Me a Coffee profile. And as always, I wanted to thank you for taking the time to listen to my podcast. Just a tiny spoiler section, something I just wanted to mention that was covered here in this episode. But if you're not interested in that, stay safe out there, and I hope to see you on the next episode. Bye! Alright, spoiler section. Like I always say, these are predominantly unscripted and just me rambling. But yeah, I think 2 points that I kind of wanted to talk about and follow up on that I mentioned in the non-spoiler section is, first off, the idea that Law can't, do certain things against like powerful enemies. And this is kind of explained away a little bit in the Wano arc when Law is facing both Kaido and Big Mom. And he specifically mentions that he can't affect them because of the fact that their haki is stronger than them. So that explanation does kind of explain it, that anyone with basically stronger haki than he has, he can't actually enforce sort of his powers on those folks. But yeah, I mean, I can sort of buy that explanation, but at the same time, it's like, it's very circumstantial still. Like, again, this scene that takes place in these sets of episodes with Doflamingo, there's like certain moments where I feel like that ability would easily negate Doflamingo a little bit. And you'd think that he can't do it because Doflamingo's haki is stronger. He has Conqueror's haki. But then Law immediately is able to shambles, Doflamingo to save Sanji. So it's just like, I don't know. It's like you wonder, where's the line? Like when is it possible for him to do that, and when is it not possible for him to do that? Is like Doflamingo kind of on that like edge where it's like he can do it if Doflamingo isn't concentrating, but people like Big Mom and Kaido, who are just like monstrously strong, like there's no way he could do it against them, even if they're not paying attention. And so yeah, it's not clear. And again, this is kind of an issue with Oda in general with haki. It's like it's not clear what the line is and what the limits are. It's always whatever serves the story the best, and that's fine. And I don't think that there are any issues with that, because ultimately, I don't think Oda abuses this, nor does he, neglect it so much that it just starts to take you out of the story. It's just sometimes, occasionally, it's like, why can't Law do this? And I mean, later on, Law does kind of the opposite in terms of like showing just how powerful haki can be when it comes to like negating devil fruits. Like when he's affected by the sort of the gender swapping powers that or the disease that Doc Q puts on him when Blackbeard basically goes after him in between within the Egghead Island arc, when he gets turned into a woman. He uses haki to change himself back as well as his crew. And so haki can like almost instantly negate a power ability. And so, yeah, I think there is a lot more to be explored with how haki sort of interacts with devil fruit powers and all of that. So, yeah, again, not really sure what I'm trying to say with this, but it's just like, it's always been very interesting to me and kind of confusing as to like when Law's Ope fruit powers can affect people and when can it not. And it's a little inconsistent in my opinion. The other thing that I kind of wanted to mention or talk a little bit more about is the 20 families, and specifically Vivi's, lineage and the Nefertari family. And we finally learned during the Egghead Island arc what actually was going on with this, or at least some of it. And so, yeah, we do learn that the Nefertari family did not decide to join the other 19 kingdoms and 19 kings up in Marijua and decided to go back home. And that not only that, but Vivi's sort of ancestor, Nefertari Lily, was a D member, making her and Cobra a D member as well. But yeah, and it turns out that she was one of the original people that decided that the poneglyphs were going to be the things that basically gave the instructions out to future generations about how to fight back and what they needed to do and where to go. And so, yeah, a lot of that is the groundwork is laid here with a lot of with in addition to the groundwork that was laid in the Arabasta arc, obviously. But yeah, it is interesting to kind of see all those points kind of leading up, because there is a lot of time that goes between Arabasta and Dressrosa and then Egghead. And it's interesting that we get this information in what would be the mirrored sort of arc in the post-time skip era, because Dressrosa is obviously meant to sort of mirror and be a grander version of the Arabasta arc, as we've kind of mentioned in the past few episodes, and as we'll see more of these sort of parallels with Arabasta. And yeah, it's interesting to see that. And obviously, I'm not going to go too far into sort of Vivi and Lily and the Nefertari family and all of that right now, because I mean that deserves its own episode on its own when it gets revealed. So I'll definitely go more into that. But I just wanted to say that, yeah, I do find it very interesting how all of those 3 points connect in terms of that storyline. Anyways, that's all I wanted to talk about in the spoilers section. So thank you for sticking around and listening to that if you did, because most of that was just really unorganized rambling. So yeah, I'll see you on the next episode. See ya.